She stood alone, yet two shadows appeared under the studio light. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Your words always bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. London, October of 1892. The gaslight glimmered in soft halos along Kensington's quiet lanes, its golden wash diffused by a rising fog that crept along the cobblestones like a living thing. It was in such a setting, familiar yet expectant, that a riddle arrived at Baker Street with the hushed weight of something long postponed. I had just returned from an evening visit to the Royal Society of Medicine when I found Holmes standing at the hearth, violin in hand, but not in motion. The bow dangled by his side, his head tilted in a manner I had long since learned to associate with internal calculation. He scarcely looked up when I entered. "You observed the mud on the lower half of the carriage door?" he asked by way of greeting. "I did," I replied, unbothered by the abruptness. "It suggests the cab had recently come from the west side of Holland Park. The foliage there is still damp with last night's rain." Holmes's thin lips curled into something that might almost be called pleased. Not entirely hopeless, then. I removed my gloves and coat, hanging them on the familiar peg. "Are we expecting a client?" "Indeed, though it is she who is late. Not I, who am early." Holmes motioned to the silver tray upon the side table, where an envelope lay opened beside the remnants of a lavender-scented note. "Mrs. Coralie Fanshawe, widow. She requests consultation regarding an encroaching shadow." Curious phrase, is it not? "Very," I said, seating myself. "You think she means a threat?" Holmes shook his head. "If so, it is one expressed in the most theatrical of terms. And that intrigues me. A shadow in a studio. Does she speak metaphorically, artistically, or quite literally of some dark figure who appears when the lamps are lit? Any of these could justify her trepidation, but her note, while brief, suggests both discretion and unease. I suspect we will find ourselves entangled in more than superstition." As if summoned by his words, a firm knock sounded at the door. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared, announcing our guest with a subtle arch of her brow that always presaged someone of interest. Mrs. Coralie Fanshawe entered with the studied grace of a woman accustomed to performing dignity in the face of pity. She was slender, cloaked in sable, her veil lifted but her mourning still freshly pressed. Her gloved hands clutched a reticule with such force I feared the stitching might give way. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Her voice held the faintest trace of Edinburgh. "Forgive the hour." "You are welcome at any hour you fear the dark, madam," Holmes replied, gesturing for her to sit. "Pray, how may we assist you?" Mrs. Fanshawe hesitated. The fire popped softly. "You must forgive me. I do not know whether what I bring you is trivial or terrible." Holmes leaned forward slightly, eyes sharpening. "Most of the terrible begins with the trivial, madam. Start at the beginning." She took a moment, as if arranging her grief into narrative. "My husband, Alaric Fanshawe, was a painter, a successful one. We lived in a townhouse off Addison Road with a private studio built on the rear garden. He died 6 months ago of a heart attack. It was sudden." She paused. Holmes did not interrupt. "I have been returning slowly to myself, sorting through his effects, managing his estate. The studio, his studio, has remained untouched, at least until last week. I decided to enter it again, alone, with the intention of cataloguing his final canvases for auction." "And what happened?" I asked gently. She turned her gaze to me. "On 3 occasions now, I've gone there in the afternoon, when the light is best, and each time, as I sit sorting through brushes or canvases, I've seen a shadow pass across the floor, interrupting the light from the south-facing window. A figure, tall, male, always in silence." "You saw someone outside?" Holmes asked quickly. "Number, that's just it." The figure moves across the inside of the room, as though cast by someone standing just outside the frame of the window, but the window opens onto a blank wall. There is no space for someone to stand. And I have kept the studio locked. No one has been inside with me. Holmes tapped his fingers together. You are certain the shadow is not your own? I know what I saw, Mr. Holmes. I believe you, he said simply. You said this has occurred thrice. Yes. And this morning I found something had shifted. A painting had been moved. One of Alaric's unfinished works. I'd left it leaning against the easel. Today it was lying face down on the floor. You believe someone has entered the studio? I do not know what to believe, but I cannot bear the ambiguity. You've spoken to the police? She hesitated. Briefly. They found no sign of forced entry, and I had not the heart to press it further. They made mention of nerves. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the spark behind his eyes. Would you permit Dr. Watson and me to examine the studio tomorrow morning? Her relief was visible. Yes, please. I will leave the side gate unlatched. The address is on the card. She withdrew a calling card, which Holmes examined with a nod. One final question, madam, he said as he stood to show her out. Did your husband have any unfinished business? Feuds, affairs of the soul or the purse that might have led to enmity? She flinched slightly. He was not an uncomplicated man, but I know of nothing that might cause this. She stood. Thank you both. When she had departed, Holmes returned to the hearth and, for the first time that evening, raised the violin. He played a single low note, sustained and eerie. Well? I asked. Well indeed, Watson. We have, it seems, a dead artist, a moving shadow, and a studio that watches more than it reveals. He placed the violin down. We shall bring lanterns. I suspect there is more to be seen in that studio's light, and perhaps even more in its darkness. The next morning, we would step into the studio of Alaric Fanshawe. But already, the ghost of something unsaid had entered the case. The morning broke grey and still, a pallid mist folding itself over the rooftops like a shawl left out overnight. Holmes and I took a hansom from Baker Street just after 8, our lanterns packed carefully in a leather case beneath the seat, along with Holmes' instrument roll and notebook. He spoke little on the ride. I knew that particular silence well. It meant his thoughts were coalescing, not idle. His eyes, though half-lidded, were alive with flickers of mental motion, scanning every fragment of Mrs. Fanshawe's account and weighing its subtleties. The cab let us off, before a modest but elegant row of brick townhouses in Addison Gardens, the kind favored by the professional artistic class. The street was quiet, save for the occasional soft hiss of a milk cart's wheels on stone. We found the wrought iron gate as promised, unlatched, its hinges silent as we passed through. The garden behind the house was modest but orderly. A narrow path of flagstones led us to the rear, where the studio stood slightly apart from the main house, joined by a short, roofed colonnade. Its outer walls were red brick, ivy-softened in parts, with tall south-facing windows bordered in pale grey stone. One stood open just a crack, its catch unfastened. Holmes took note of this immediately, glancing once at the sill before stepping through the side door, which yielded under his touch. The interior of the studio bore the scent of turpentine and dust, familiar to any who have ever been in an artist's private domain. The tall window panes let in a generous wash of pale light, and a scattering of unfinished canvases, easels, and crates ringed the large central floor. Near the back wall stood the fallen painting, a large, half-completed portrait now face down against the floorboards. Holmes moved with slow deliberation, his eyes darting from shadow to surface. I remained near the entrance, letting him conduct his silent survey uninterrupted. He crouched briefly to examine the base of the window, then rose and approached the fallen canvas, circling it before crouching again. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "there is something very peculiar about this room. I moved closer, my boots quiet against the boards. "The painting?" He nodded toward it. "Yes, but not only that. Observe." He gestured toward the layer of fine dust that blanketed the studio floor, unremarkable at first glance, until Holmes pointed out a set of impressions near Carp, the easel. "There," he said. "Two sets of marks, barely visible. Someone stood here, likely last night. One shoe with a worn outer edge on the heel. No scuff marks leading in, though." I looked toward the door. "The floor near the entrance is bare of dust. The draft must clear it." "Just so," he said. "And yet this disturbance is not near the door, nor the window. It is isolated. Someone stood here and either watched or handled something, but without pacing. The marks are stationary." He rose and stepped behind the canvas, lifting it gently upright. The painted side faced us now, an unfinished portrait of a man seated in profile. The face was only partially rendered, a fine outline in charcoal beneath pale washes of ochre and umber. The hand was almost entirely done, resting on a walking cane, the knuckles distinct. Holmes examined the edge of the canvas with his fingers. "There's a thin line of newer dust on this portion. It suggests the canvas had remained upright for quite some time before falling." "You think it was pushed?" I asked. He looked toward the window. "Perhaps. But more likely it was handled and dropped. Someone startled, perhaps. Or someone in haste. The curious element is what lies beneath." He tilted the canvas slightly, and I caught sight of a name etched faintly into the wooden frame. "R. Leving," I read aloud. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Not Alaric Fanshaw's work, then, at least not originally. Curious." We explored the rest of the studio with care. The cabinets held dozens of brushes, jars of pigment and sketches, some half-formed, others mere gestures of expression. A tall cupboard in the corner, locked at first, yielded to Holmes's tools. Inside were older pieces, some clearly unfinished studies, a few framed with dates ranging back nearly a decade. One stood out, a small oil of a woman in deep mourning seated in a chair by a window. The brushwork was precise, but the facial features were left indistinct, as though the artist had either never finished or deliberately chosen to obscure them. The label at the bottom read only CF. Holmes tapped it gently. Coralie Fanshawe, yet painted before the style shift in the rest of this work. This may have been an early piece, or perhaps repurposed. "What do you mean?" I asked. He turned. "Note the framing. The inner edge is more modern than the outer. This canvas was reframed, likely recently." He stepped back from the cabinet and surveyed the studio one last time. "There is more here than mere spectral suggestion, Watson. Shadows do not move unless something moves them." We locked the studio behind us and returned to the street. Holmes silent once more until we were halfway back to Baker Street. When he finally spoke, it was as if resuming a thought I had not heard the beginning of. "The name Leving may be more than artistic attribution," he said. "Do you recall a painter of that surname?" "Raymond, Leving." I frowned. "It sounds vaguely familiar." "Scandal, Watson. 2 years ago. A commission for a portrait of a young baronet's wife ended with threats of litigation. Leving vanished before the trial could proceed. Whispers of forgery, seduction, even blackmail. It was a fashionable mess. And now one of his canvases ends up in Alaric Fanshaw's studio." Holmes nodded. "Hidden behind an unfinished painting, no less. Perhaps Fanshawe was assisting Leving, or perhaps concealing his disgrace. Either way, we must know more." When we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes sent 3 telegrams, one to the registrar at the Royal Academy, one to an art dealer he trusted in Pall Mall, and one to Inspector Lestrade, phrased as only Holmes could phrase it. "Do you recall what became of the Raymond Leving affair? Details urgent. H. The rest of the day passed with Holmes in deep meditation, interrupted only by a late lunch and 2 violin fugues, which he played with increasing agitation. The shadows lengthened outside, and the fog returned in earnest. Just after 6, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson brought in a sealed envelope. Holmes opened it and read silently, then passed it to me. It was from Lestrade. Leving never stood trial. Vanished after last sighting in Fitzrovia. Rumors place him abroad. Official file marked unresolved. No known address. Several works still disputed in private collections. Holmes tapped the paper. So he is officially lost to time, yet somehow his signature lies behind a canvas in the private studio of a man who died 6 months ago. And the moving shadow? I asked. Holmes looked up sharply. Is beginning to look less like a ghost and more like a man with reason to fear discovery. That night as I turned in, I could not help but revisit the image of their studio. The light on the floor, the silence, and the unfinished face, traced in fading lines, waiting as though it might at any moment resolve into someone watching from within. Holmes, I knew, was not finished. He had already begun pulling at the invisible threads, and I, as ever, followed where they led. The following morning brought with it a stinging drizzle, the sort that clings to collars and creeps behind the ears. I descended the stairs to find Holmes already at the table, his breakfast untouched, a telegram opened beside his cup. He was seated motionless, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the carpet as though deciphering its weave. Before I could speak, he handed me the telegram without looking up. It was from his contact at the Royal Academy. R. Leving, formerly Raymond Levinge, expelled in 1890 after forged submissions uncovered. Last known associate, Alaric Fanshawe. Shared a studio briefly. Dispute over ownership of several canvases. Levinge vanished shortly thereafter. Record closed. So the connection between Fanshawe and Levinge is confirmed, I said, returning the slip. But the quarrel, do you believe it turned violent? Holmes looked up, his expression unreadable. Possibly, but the facts do not yet suggest murder. Levinge disappeared in disgrace, but not under criminal suspicion. Still, if Fanshawe had possession of a disputed canvas, and if someone wished to retrieve or conceal it, that would explain the tampering in the studio. Then who's moving the shadow? I asked. Levinge himself. He'd be recognized. Not necessarily, Holmes replied. Disgrace lends itself to transformation. A man like Levinge would likely alter his name, perhaps even his appearance. But a shadow, Watson. A shadow betrays more than a face. At that moment, another message arrived. This time from the art dealer in Pall Mall. Holmes tore it open swiftly. Canvas marked R. Leving seen in minor auction 6 months ago, purchased by Alaric Fanshawe, privately through intermediary. Believed to be portrait of Lady Harrowgate, rumored to be original, not copy. Could expose scandal. Holmes's eyes lit with something close to triumph. Now we approach substance. Lady Harrowgate. Her husband is Sir Felix Harrowgate, Member of Parliament, not known for forgiving errors, real or imagined. Levinge's painting of her would be unwise to circulate. If Fanshawe possessed such a piece, and if he intended to reveal it, then someone had motive to ensure it never saw daylight, I finished. Just so, and we have a shadow that walks across the studio light at the same hour, unseen save for its trace. No theft, no violence, but a warning. A presence. Do you think the painting of Lady Harrowgate is still there? I asked. I doubt it, Holmes replied, rising. It would be the first thing taken, but its absence may tell us more than its presence. Come, Watson, we are due once again at Addison Gardens. This time I intend to speak not only to canvas and shadow, but to the widow herself. An hour later, we were shown once again into the back parlor of the Fanshawe residence. Mrs. Fanshawe looked less distressed than before, though a trace of guarded tension still hung about her eyes. She wore a navy morning dress, and a leather-bound ledger lay open on her lap. I did not expect you so soon, she said with a small smile. Has something happened? Several things, Holmes replied, his tone light but precise. But they are all pieces of the same puzzle. Forgive my bluntness, madam. What do you know of Raymond Levinge? Her lips parted slightly, and the color drained just a fraction from her cheeks. Raymond? Ray Levinge. He was an acquaintance, years ago. My husband knew him better. More than acquaintances, I believe, Holmes said. They shared a studio. They quarreled, and one of Levinge's paintings recently found its way back into your husband's possession. One that, if exposed, could have proved quite inconvenient to a certain Lady Harrogate. She set the ledger aside. I hadn't thought of Raymond in years, not until that canvas appeared. Alaric never told me where he got it. It was wrapped in paper when it arrived. I only glimpsed the name scrawled on the back, R. Leving. That was 2 weeks before his death. Do you recall if anyone visited in that time? Anyone unusual? Holmes asked. Mrs. Fanshawe hesitated. There was a man. A few days before Alaric died. He called himself Mr. Rowe? Said he was interested in a commission, but he didn't return. I never saw him again. Holmes's brow arched. What did he look like? Tall, pale, hair thinning at the temples. He wore a thick scarf despite the warmth. And he kept his gloves on the whole time. I remember it because Alaric was irritated by him. He said the man asked about older work, things Alaric hadn't painted in years. Could he have been Levinge? I don't know. But I felt something was wrong. Office. He watched the studio window as we spoke. Not me. Holmes stood. Madam, I advise you keep the studio locked until further notice. And please, do not go there alone again. She gave a small nod. I won't. But Mr. Holmes, what is it you think I've walked into? He offered no answer. Only a slight bow, and we took our leave. Back at Baker Street, Holmes began sketching a diagram in pencil. Markings of time, window, angle of shadow, and position of objects on the floor. I watched as he constructed something that, to my eye, seemed abstract geometry. You said the shadow moved laterally, across the room, without any corresponding change in the window's light, I said. But what does that mean? It means the source of the shadow is not outside the window, Holmes replied, still sketching. It is within. Someone has access to a hidden panel, a secondary entrance, or a vantage point we have not yet considered. The consistency of the shadow indicates a repeated action, deliberate, almost rehearsed. But if the goal is intimidation, why not confront Mrs. Fanshawe directly? Because she is not the target. The message was meant for someone else, possibly for Fanshawe before his death, or for someone who might discover the painting afterward. That afternoon, Holmes departed alone for an undisclosed appointment. He returned near dusk, a faint streak of soot on his cuff and the unmistakable smell of old stone dust clinging to his coat. There is a narrow service alley that runs behind the Fanshawe property, he said without preamble. It leads to the wall opposite the studio window. There's a gap in the masonry, high, nearly invisible unless you know where to look. Just large enough for a mirror or reflective plate to be propped. I stared at him. You think someone's creating the shadow with light? I do. With a lantern, perhaps angled through a prism or screen. It would cast a silhouette across the inside of the studio, appearing as a shadow walking across the room. But to what end? To unsettle, to warn, or to distract? Holmes leaned closer. But now we are no longer uncertain. Tonight, Watson, we return to the studio. Not by day, not to observe the aftermath, but to intercept the performance. We will go before the hour the shadow appears, and we shall see whether it returns. And if it does, we shall meet it face to face. A thin thrill ran through me, part fear, part anticipation. For all the stories I had penned of Holmes's exploits, nothing stirred the blood quite like the prospect of a trap set in silence, with the truth as the bait and darkness as the hunter's mask. That evening, the fog would not be the only thing moving through Addison Gardens. and we, for once, would be waiting on the other side of the shadow. We left Baker Street under the cover of night, a creeping mist rising from the gutters as though the very city conspired to conceal us. Holmes had dressed in his least conspicuous attire, a plain coat, flat cap, and gloves worn thin at the fingertips. I had similarly forsworn my usual collar and watch chain. The lanterns we carried were hooded, their lenses narrowed to mere slits to avoid casting any stray light until the appointed moment. We arrived near Addison Gardens by foot, looping once around the back alley Holmes had discovered earlier. He pointed without speaking to the narrow fissure in the brick wall, a crack no more than a palm's width, nearly 20 feet from the studio window. A small wooden crate rested nearby, hidden behind a half-toppled trellis. Holmes crouched to inspect it. "Dust-free," he murmured. "Used recently, likely for elevation. Observe the angle, Watson, just enough height to bring the slit in line with the lower sash of the studio's central window. And this—" He plucked a small shard of glass wedged into the wall's mortar, holding it to the light. Burnished edge, likely part of a convex lens or plate, broken recently. "A lantern projection," I whispered, suddenly understanding. "A shadow cast not from a person, but from an image." "Precisely," Holmes said. "A ghost engineered with optics and silence. But the question remains, who arranged this little theater, and why?" We entered the garden gate as quietly as we could manage, Holmes disabling the studio door's lock with a slender tool in under 10 seconds. Inside, the air was cold and stale, and even in the dim lantern light, the studio retained its atmosphere of arrested movement. The painting of the man in profile had been returned upright, though now slightly shifted, its placement 2 inches off from where we had found it the day before. Holmes took up position behind a large armoire facing the window, and I settled on a stool near the easel, my lantern extinguished and my nerves taut. We waited. The silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of a small brass carriage clock on the studio shelf. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I could just make out Holmes's silhouette, motionless, almost statue-like in the gloom. The fog outside had thickened, rendering the window a dull grey smear. Then, without warning, a flicker. A faint, wavering movement crossed the wooden floor, a tall, thin silhouette gliding silently across the room from right to left, exactly as Mrs. Fanshawe had described. My breath caught. I turned slightly, trying to see Holmes's face, but he had already risen from behind the armoire. In one smooth movement, he struck a match and lit the lantern's full beam, swinging it toward the window. The shadow vanished instantly. But we had seen it. Vivid, deliberate, calculated. Holmes was already moving, gesturing for me to follow. We exited through the side door and crossed the garden at a crouch, slipping through the gate into the alley behind the wall. There, in the mist, we saw him. A tall man, dressed in a heavy overcoat and scarf, crouched before the brick fissure. He was adjusting a small collapsible box lantern on a stand, angled upward, and beside it, a thin pane of frosted glass mounted in a wooden frame. Holmes sprang forward. "That will do," he said coolly. "You've performed the scene enough times. The curtain falls here." The man started violently, knocking over the lantern. He stumbled back, but Holmes caught him by the arm and spun him toward the wall. I saw his face clearly for the first time, hollow cheeks, eyes like scorched coals, and a mouth that twitched with nerves long unraveled. I don't know what you mean. Let me go." "Raymond Levinge," Holmes said almost gently. "Or is it Rowe still? I admit the scarf was clever, but not clever enough. You were never very good at hiding your signature." The man sagged slightly in Holmes's grasp, his resistance vanishing as if a string had been cut. "Am I to be arrested?" he asked in a whisper. "Not yet," Holmes replied. "First, you'll explain." We brought him into the studio and sat him on a crate near the window. He trembled as he looked around the space, and it was clear from the way his eyes lingered on the unfinished painting that this was not his first visit. Holmes folded his arms. "You returned to the studio after Fanshaw's death." "Why?" Levinge didn't answer at first. Then, "Because it was mine. That painting, Lady Harrowgate. I painted it before everything collapsed, before Fanshawe turned on me. I wanted it back." "You came to retrieve it?" "I came to see if he had kept it, if he still had it. When I found it missing, I thought perhaps someone else had taken it, Coralie or some dealer, but I couldn't ask outright. I couldn't show my face." "So you devised this spectacle," Holmes said, "a shadow to frighten her from the studio." "She's a superstitious woman," Levinge muttered, "and grief makes people believe strange things. I thought if I unsettled her enough, she'd abandon the place and I could search it properly." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And if you'd found the painting?" "I'd have burned it," Levinge said with a sudden, bitter fierceness. "Do you know what it would mean if it surfaced now? What it would do to her, to me? That portrait. It wasn't only art. It was leverage. Alaric knew it. He kept it as a knife at my throat." "You believe he used it against you?" Levinge stared down at his gloved hands. "He was going to sell it, quietly, through an auction house. Let it resurface. Ruin Harrowgate. Ruin me. I came to reason with him. Beg if I had to." Holmes's voice cooled. "You spoke to him the week he died?" "Yes." "And what happened?" "He laughed at me. Told me to prepare for infamy. Said scandal was currency and he meant to spend it." Levinge looked up, his face drawn. "I didn't kill him. I swear to you. I left that day. I never saw him again." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "Do you know where the painting is now?" Levinge shook his head. "If he hid it, it wasn't here." Holmes glanced at me. "Then that is our next task. Finding it before someone else does." He turned back to Levinge. "You will remain in London. I shall inform Inspector Lestrade of your presence, but as of this moment, I make no charges. Should you attempt to flee, however—" "I won't," Levinge muttered. "I've already been running too long." We escorted him as far as the alley mouth and watched him disappear into the night. Back at the studio, Holmes relit the lantern and returned to the fallen canvas once again, the unfinished man in profile. He stared at it, then crouched and ran his fingers along the lower edge of the wooden stretcher. With a sudden motion, he pulled the canvas free from the frame. A second, thinner canvas had been hidden beneath it, pressed flat, its surface obscured by the first. When Holmes turned it, even I gasped. The portrait was unmistakable. A woman in white silk seated near a piano, her left hand delicately lifting a sheet of music, her face turned slightly toward the viewer. It was a likeness rendered with striking intimacy and clarity, and though I had only seen her once, from a photograph years before, there was no doubt it was Lady Harrowgate. Holmes gave a low whistle. "The painting within the painting," he murmured. "Fanshawe hid it not behind a cupboard or under a stair, but beneath his own art, a secret only another painter might uncover." He stood. "Tomorrow, Watson, we visit Sir Felix Harrowgate, and we shall learn whether this portrait was meant as an act of vengeance or a cry for help." The shadow, it seemed, was not done with us yet. The next morning was sharp with the bite of autumn wind, the kind that seemed to stiffen the very soul. Holmes and I took breakfast in silence, though his eyes never strayed far from the painting propped discreetly against the corner wall of the sitting room, its sheet carefully drawn over the surface like a curtain yet to be raised. The likeness of Lady Harrowgate lingered in both our minds, elegant, luminous, too intimate by half. It was a portrait not only of a woman, but of the painter's desire for her. "Are we to take it directly to Sir Felix?" I asked. Holmes looked up from his cup. Number confrontation must never precede information. "We visit the Harrowgate household today, but we go without the painting. First, we listen. You expect him to confirm the scandal? I expect him to reveal whether the scandal is present reality or merely a threat held in suspension. Holmes rose and retrieved the painted canvas that had masked the hidden portrait. This false cover, he said, tapping the surface with a fingernail, was created by Fanshawe with deliberation. Why conceal it so carefully unless the risk of its discovery outweighed the value of exposure? We departed shortly thereafter, taking a cab through the widening streets of Belgravia. The Harrowgate residence was a tall, stately affair of creamstone and wrought iron, 3 stories with high windows and an almost clerical severity in its design. A footman in pale livery admitted us after Holmes presented his card, and we were shown into a drawing-room appointed with military precision. Mahogany, books in rows too untouched to have been read, and a large oil painting above the fireplace. Sir Felix himself, dressed in a colonel's uniform, glaring out as though prepared to review the entire household at dawn. He entered in person not long after. A tall man, grey at the temples, eyes like flint, and shoulders squared as though still in parade. He nodded once to us without warmth. "Mr. Holmes, I was told you asked for a few minutes." "Only a few," Holmes said smoothly. "We're investigating a matter concerning the late Alaric Fanshawe." Sir Felix's mouth tightened. "Ah, you knew him?" "Only in passing. My wife sat for him briefly, many years ago. A misstep, corrected. I understand the portrait was never made public." "Because I ensured it wasn't," Sir Felix replied, his voice low. "Fanshawe had the gall to hint at insinuations. I paid a tidy sum to see the piece destroyed." "You paid Fanshawe?" "Number his associate at the time. Lavinge. He was the real threat. Blackmailer disguised as an artist. I had him warned off, quietly. That was the end of it." "And your wife?" Sir Felix's gaze sharpened. "Was never involved in anything improper. She was young and foolish. She wanted to be immortalized." She came to her senses. Holmes nodded as though in agreement. "And yet the portrait survived. Perhaps not in public hands, but carefully preserved." Sir Felix's jaw flexed. "Are you saying it still exists?" "I am." There was a long silence. The colonel's hands clenched once behind his back. "Then it must be destroyed." "Immediately. Whatever your fee, I'll pay it. I won't have my wife dragged through the gutter on account of a decade-old lapse in judgment." Holmes tilted his head. "And what if someone else already possesses a copy, or intends to sell the original?" Sir Felix's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then tell me who they are, and I shall make the matter vanish." Holmes took a long breath. "You misunderstand, Sir Felix. I am not your agent, nor your confessor. I came only to confirm the truth." Sir Felix moved toward the fireplace. He reached for the poker and stirred the coals with short, hard thrusts. "I have political enemies, Mr. Holmes. Do you know what they would do with such an image? Even an innocent one?" "I do," Holmes said. "But I'm more interested in why Alaric Fanshawe preserved the painting for so long, hidden, not sold, and why he suddenly decided, in the weeks before his death, to bring it into the open." Sir Felix turned sharply. "He did what?" Holmes said nothing more. He inclined his head in farewell. "Thank you for your time, Sir Felix. That will be all." As we left the house, I asked, "You believe he knew that the painting survived?" "Not until now, but now he will begin to act, and that may serve us better than any confession." Back at Baker Street, we found a note waiting, from Inspector Lestrade requesting Holmes's presence at Scotland Yard. We arrived to find the inspector pacing before his desk, his brow furrowed in that particular way it only did when circumstance refused to obey reason. "I've got a development," he said, "but I doubt you'll like it." "Go on," Holmes said. "There was a break-in reported early this morning at the rear entrance of the Briarstone auction house. just off Bond Street. No items missing, but one strongbox opened. Contained records, correspondence, and a consignment list including the name A. Fanshawe. One of the clerks claims he saw a man fleeing down the alley behind the premises, tall, scarf over the face. Holmes didn't react outwardly. Was anything damaged? Number, but someone's searching, Holmes, and they're looking in the same place as you are. Did the witness give a direction of flight? Lestrade nodded. South toward Hanover Square. He lost him in the fog. Holmes folded his arms. If it was Levange, he's gone to ground, but I don't think it was. This feels less like desperation, more like interference. You mean Harrogate? I mean someone working for Harrogate, perhaps, or someone with interest in suppressing any trail back to that portrait. Holmes turned toward the window, but the trail is now too warm. Too many hands have touched it. Lestrade's expression darkened. You think there's more coming? I do. That evening, just past 9, Mrs. Fanshawe arrived unexpectedly at Baker Street, her face pale beneath her veil. I received a letter, she said without preamble. No signature, no return address. It was slipped under the front door. She handed it to Holmes, who opened it without comment. The note was short, typed, clipped from a machine. Forget the painting. You're being watched. Further action will result in consequences. Burn what you found. Holmes handed the note to me and turned to Mrs. Fanshawe. Has anyone followed you? I don't think so. Good. Then you'll remain here tonight. But no argument. You are now a variable in a very delicate equation. Removing you from the board, even briefly, increases our odds. She acquiesced, and Holmes rang Mrs. Hudson to prepare the guest room. When we were alone, he unrolled a map of London and marked 3 locations: Fanshaw's studio, the auction house, and Harrogate's residence. There is a triangle here, Watson, but the apex is still hidden. You mean the motive? Number, the intent. Who truly wanted that portrait out? Who benefits from exposure, or from its threat? You suspect Mrs. Fanshawe? Holmes shook his head. Number, but I suspect someone else believed she knew more than she did. He placed the map aside. Tomorrow we speak to the one person left whose name appears nowhere, yet whose likeness is the very center of the storm. Lady Harrogate. He nodded. And if the shadow we're chasing is truly cast by fear, Watson, she will tell us whose hands hold the lantern. We departed early the next morning while the city was still emerging from the veil of fog that hung low and pale over the rooftops. Mrs. Fanshawe remained behind at Baker Street under Mrs. Hudson's discreet care, and Holmes, with his usual indifference to breakfast, consumed nothing but a cup of black tea and a half-slice of toast as we prepared. The note had changed everything. What was once the ghost of a scandal now showed teeth. Someone, somewhere, believed Coralie Fanshawe was a threat worth silencing. Lady Harrogate, as Holmes had surmised, was the fulcrum. Her likeness sat at the center of a web. One strand reaching toward the past in the form of Levange, another toward her husband, whose rage was too sharp to be simple pride, and the third, perhaps, toward Fanshawe himself, who might have preserved the painting not for money or blackmail, but for reasons more personal and, perhaps, more dangerous. It took considerable persuasion and a personal note from Holmes invoking an urgent matter of confidentiality before we were granted audience with Lady Harrogate alone. The butler, clearly unaccustomed to deviating from protocol, eyed us with suspicion as he admitted us through the service entrance and led us to a modest conservatory at the rear of the house. The room was quiet, warm with filtered sunlight, and faintly scented with orchids. Lady Harrogate entered without entourage. She was no longer the young woman in the portrait. Still, beautiful, certainly, but with a grace that had settled into something cooler, more inward. She regarded us both with wary intelligence. I assume, she said, folding her hands, this is not about my husband's portrait above the fireplace. No, Holmes said gently. It is about yours. She gave no visible reaction. That painting was destroyed years ago. No, madam. It was hidden, and we have reason to believe your husband has only just learned of its survival. At this, her gaze faltered, just for an instant, and then she sat. I had hoped, she said after a long pause, that the past had finally exhausted its appetite. You sat for Raymond Levinge, Holmes said, his tone neutral. I did. I was 23. Alaric Fanshawe was considered too severe, too modern, but Raymond, he made one feel like a poem. He sketched me in a week. The oil took longer. Was there more between you than the commission? No, she said. Then softer, but he hoped there would be. And your husband? I asked. He was furious. Not because of the portrait, but because it had intimacy. There was nothing compromising in the pose. No nudity, no impropriety. But it showed too much of me. More than I gave even in private. That was Raymond's gift, you see. He didn't just paint what he saw. He painted what you never meant to show. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Fanshawe acquired the painting months before his death. Do you know why? I don't. I didn't even know it still existed. I thought it had been burned. Raymond disappeared. My husband silenced the affair. It was as though the portrait had never happened. Until now. Holmes studied her face. Someone believes you are involved again. Mrs. Fanshawe received a threat, typed, anonymous, urging her to destroy what was found. Lady Harrowgate's expression didn't shift, but her voice changed slightly. Cooler, clipped. Then someone else has more to lose than I do. You mean your husband? I mean the man who sent the threat, and it wasn't Felix. I know how he thinks. His fury is direct. He doesn't whisper through typewriters. Then who? She paused again. Then there was someone else. At the time, a man who advised Felix when the portrait scandal nearly broke. Legal counsel, though unofficially. A Mr. Evan Claridge. Not a solicitor? Not quite. A fixer. He handled things for the Harrowgates before and after Felix inherited the title. Is he still involved with your family? I've no idea. We've not spoken in years. But if Felix recently learned the painting survived, it's possible Claridge would be tasked to make it disappear, along with anything else. Holmes nodded. Would you be willing to swear to that? I would. But Felix wouldn't know I had. He stood. You've been very helpful, Lady Harrowgate. She stood too, her poise unshaken. Mr. Holmes, what happens now? That depends, Holmes said, already turning to go, on how desperate Mr. Claridge has become. Back on the street, Holmes hailed a cab and gave an address in Clerkenwell. When I asked, he said only, Claridge had a registry entry at that address until last year. Let us see if the shadows he casts are longer than the studios. The building was a nondescript row house converted into offices. A brass placard at the door still read, E. Claridge, Private Inquiries. Holmes pressed the bell. No response. We waited. Holmes tested the latch and found it secure. He stepped back, glanced up at the second-floor windows, then crossed the street. From there, he studied the building's rear access, noting the alley, the fire escape, and the waste bins that hadn't been moved in some days. We'll return tonight, he said. That evening, just after 10, we came back by foot and waited in the alley behind Claridge's building. Holmes had taken to pacing slowly along the rear wall, examining every brick and ledge. Then he stopped, crouched, and held up a piece of black cloth. A glove, he murmured. Recently dropped. Still warm. We heard it then. The faintest creak of a second-floor window opening. Holmes motioned to me, and we slipped behind the bins. Above, a figure leaned out, scanning the alley. The light from inside cast a narrow silhouette. Tall, narrow shoulders, head sharply outlined. Holmes stepped into the moonlight deliberately. "Mr. Claridge," he called, "there's no need to flee. But if you do, I guarantee I'll catch you by the next turning." The figure froze, then withdrew. Moments later, the rear door opened, and a man emerged, adjusting his coat with theatrical slowness. His face was long and pale, his hair neatly parted, and his expression resigned. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I've been expecting you." Holmes said nothing. Claridge raised his hands, palms up. "I haven't touched the painting. I didn't steal it, I only tried to keep it quiet." "By threatening a widow," I snapped. Claridge's eyes flicked to me. That note was meant to prevent escalation. Nothing more. Holmes stepped closer. "Why now? Why the urgency?" Claridge's jaw tightened. "Because Felix panicked. He called me the day after your visit. Told me everything. He thinks Lady Harrogate is working against him. He believes she sent the painting to the press." Holmes's voice was a whisper. "Has she?" "Number." But Felix doesn't trust silence. He wanted it gone. The auction record, the estate ledger. Any trace? I was to clean it all. Quietly. "You broke into Briarstone's records," Holmes said. Claridge didn't deny it. "You knew about Levinge?" "I knew he'd painted it. I didn't know he was still alive." Holmes stared at him. Unreadable. "Where is Felix Harrogate now?" Claridge hesitated. "Tonight, I believe. He's at his club." Holmes turned on his heel. "Then we'll pay him a final visit." The truth, it seemed, had begun to move faster than the shadows, and someone, very soon, was going to be exposed in full light. It was just past 11 when we arrived at the Corinthian Club, a brooding, colonnaded fixture on Pall Mall, whose silence belied the influence concentrated within. The doorman, accustomed to discretion but not intimidation, hesitated as Holmes produced a card bearing no official authority and a name that rang like a distant echo in such circles. "We must speak with Sir Felix Harrogate," Holmes said in a tone that brooked no delay. "You will inform him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson request an immediate audience. It pertains to a matter of discretion and consequence." The man vanished into the velvet-lined interior without further question. We waited in the outer vestibule, the faint smell of cigars and mahogany curling out from the room beyond. A minute passed, then 2. When the doorman returned, his expression was unreadable. "Sir Felix will receive you." The library. He led us down a narrow corridor to a private room panelled in walnut, dimly lit by a single shaded lamp. Sir Felix stood by the hearth with a brandy in hand, his posture taut. He did not offer seats. "You said this was urgent." Holmes inclined his head. "It is." Sir Felix said nothing, his face carved into stillness. Holmes stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "The painting survives. That much you know. What you may not know is that it was hidden by Fanshawe not to expose you, but perhaps to shield someone else. He died before we could ask why." Sir Felix's eyes flicked to me, then back to Holmes. "You expect me to confess something?" "I expect you to understand, Sir Felix," Holmes said, "that events have passed beyond your control. You sent Claridge to erase the trail. He failed. Levinge is alive. We have the portrait, and your wife, though she has said nothing, knows more than you suspect." Sir Felix drained the last of his drink in a single motion. "She always knew more. That was the problem." Holmes raised a brow. "Then it was not merely the scandal you feared." He turned from the fire and set the glass down. "The painting didn't just reveal her face, it revealed me." There was a pause. I looked at Holmes, uncertain. "My marriage," Harrogate said, voice low, "was a transaction. Connections, families, appearances. I admired her, yes, but that intimacy, the one Levinge captured, I never had it. That portrait made it visible. To me, to the world, she was his in ways she never was mine, and I could not bear it." You tried to bury the image, Holmes said softly. But it wouldn't stay buried. He nodded once, stiffly. I paid for silence, for disappearance, and still it returned. When Claridge told me Fanshawe had it, I panicked. I ordered him to act, but I did not tell him how far to go. Did you meet with Fanshawe yourself? Holmes asked. Number I hadn't seen the man in years. Then who warned him? Who told him his possession of the portrait was dangerous? Sir Felix hesitated. Then, Claridge, likely. He said he would handle it. I told him to deal with it. I didn't ask how. Holmes stepped closer, his voice taut. Sir Felix, do you understand what I'm suggesting? If Claridge threatened Fanshawe, if he attempted to coerce or frighten him, and if that led to a confrontation, then the man's death may not have been natural. At this, Harrowgate's mask slipped. You believe Claridge killed him? I don't yet know, Holmes said. But someone did. And Fanshawe's death, timed just as the portrait was unearthed and the records retrieved, is too conveniently timed to ignore. Sir Felix sat abruptly in a leather-backed chair, as though gravity had at last taken hold of him. I never wanted her hurt, he muttered. Only unseen. Then you must help us make her safe now, Holmes said. Someone has escalated matters far beyond the bounds of dignity. Mrs. Fanshawe has received threats. Lavinge is in hiding, and Claridge is far from finished. Sir Felix looked up slowly. What do you propose? Holmes's eyes met his. A public statement. Tomorrow. Announce that the portrait, long presumed destroyed, was rediscovered and will be donated to the Royal Academy's private archive, sealed and never shown. A gift in memory of Alaric Fanshawe, whose artistic judgment you now regret ever questioning. You will claim your wife's approval, and you will name Claridge nowhere. You wish to preserve the fiction, Sir Felix said bitterly. I wish to control the story, Holmes replied, and to remove Claridge's last thread of leverage. If he has nothing to suppress, he will stop, or make a mistake. Sir Felix said nothing for a long while. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. I'll do it, but if this turns ugly, I shall be watching, Holmes said quietly. We departed in silence, and the rain had begun by the time we stepped into the street. Holmes drew his coat close and set a brisk pace. I dislike giving that man the satisfaction of rewriting his motives, I said. We are not preserving his reputation, Holmes replied. We are removing his weapon. By the time we reached Baker Street, it was past 1. Mrs. Fanshawe was awake in the sitting room, her face pale but composed. Holmes sat beside her and spoke with a gentleness I had rarely seen in him. Tomorrow, the world will believe that your husband's final work has been surrendered with honor. There will be no scandal, no shadow, and no more threats. She studied his face. But the truth, he nodded slowly, will remain yours. And ours. She reached into her bag and drew out something unexpected. A small key on a blue ribbon. I found this tucked inside the spine of one of Alaric's ledgers, she said. It's to a safety deposit box. I didn't know he kept one. Holmes took it delicately. Then we'll open it, together. It was the final piece. And in the morning, at the vault near St. James's, we unlocked a narrow drawer to find one final canvas, smaller than the others. A sketch, unfinished, in graphite and red chalk. It was of Lavinge. The artist's signature, A. Fanshawe, was scrawled beneath. The face was gaunt, tired, captured with aching detail. Not a portrait of hatred or revenge. A study of someone pitied, perhaps forgiven. Fanshawe saw him, I said quietly, before the end. Holmes closed the drawer and chose not to ruin him. Perhaps that is the only kind of justice art ever grants. Outside, the rain had stopped. London stretched before us, grey, wide and waiting, and behind us, the shadow in the studio light had vanished for good. The day unfolded with the dull sheen of a London sky draped in pewter, low and still. Holmes, for once, had not touched his violin. The atmosphere in our rooms was one of taut calm, a calm that did not ease, only held steady, like the final stretch of rope before the drop. Mrs. Fanshawe had left early under discreet escort, returning to her own home now that the public statement had appeared in the Morning Chronicle. As Holmes had suggested, the piece bore Sir Felix Harrowgate's name, full of regret and dignity. It spoke of a newly discovered work by the late Alaric Fanshawe, an unfinished portrait of unknown origin, now gifted in memoriam to the Royal Academy. There was no mention of the subject, no reference to Raymond Lavinge, and no echo of the painting's troubled provenance. Holmes watched the page in silence, seated at the breakfast table with the paper open and untouched coffee cooling beside it. "It's a well-orchestrated bit of theatre," I said. "Claridge will see it for what it is." "Precisely the point," Holmes murmured. "He'll recognize it as a warning, but not to him alone. A blade concealed by a curtain is more dangerous than one drawn." "Do you think he'll move?" "I think he's already moving, and that he may no longer be acting under orders." Before I could press him further, there was a knock, rapid, urgent. Mrs. Hudson opened the door without waiting for summons, her face tight. "A man's downstairs," she said, voice low. "Insists he must see Mr. Holmes. He's in some kind of trouble." Holmes was on his feet instantly. "Name?" "Says he's called Lavinge. Looks like death." In a flash, Holmes was at the stairs. I followed. Raymond Lavinge was seated in the entryway, hunched forward, his overcoat clinging to him with damp. His hands shook as he tried to rise. I saw now how deeply the years had worked on him. The pallor, the half-healed bruising on his jaw, the tremor in his right eye. "I had nowhere else to go," he muttered. "He found me." "Claridge?" Holmes asked. Lavinge nodded. "He came to my lodging last night. How he found it, I don't know. He said I'd open the door again, that now he would close it. He said if I spoke another word to you, I'd end up just like Fanshawe." "Fanshawe didn't die of fright," Holmes said flatly. Lavinge's voice cracked. "Number." "He didn't." We brought him up to the sitting room, set him by the fire, and pressed hot brandy into his shaking hands. When he had recovered a little, Holmes sat across from him, legs crossed, face impassive. "You're going to tell me the truth now, Lavinge? All of it. Not for my benefit, but for hers." "Mrs. Fanshawe?" "Yes. She deserves to know the shape of what killed her husband." Lavinge looked into the fire. "I didn't go there to threaten Alaric. I went to beg. I thought maybe if I told him how far I'd fallen, he might see fit to return the painting or destroy it or anything. But he didn't want to destroy it. He told me he'd already offered it. Not for money, not for scandal, as a gift. To Coralie." "To his wife?" I said. "Why would he?" "Because he wanted her to see it," Lavinge whispered. "Because he knew what it meant to her. I think, in his own way, he thought it would bring her closure. Or clarity." "And you left after that?" Holmes asked. "Yes. He told me I had nothing left to fear, that it was over." "But Claridge didn't see it that way," Holmes muttered. "And when the painting vanished shortly after Fanshawe's death, it meant someone had interfered. That's when the shadow games began." Lavinge's eyes glistened. "I didn't kill him, Holmes, but I think someone else did." Holmes stood, pacing. "And now Claridge wants to silence everyone who ever touched that canvas. The letter to Mrs. Fanshawe, the break-in at Briarstone, and now you." He stopped suddenly, as if struck by something unseen. "Watson, the safe deposit sketch, it wasn't just a portrait. It was a message." I rose. "What do you mean?" The face Fanshawe drew of Lavinge, with such care, such detail. But the signature, it wasn't his usual hand. It wasn't a flourish. It was almost tentative. hidden, as though he knew someone would open it, someone who needed to see it. I felt the chill then. Claridge. Holmes nodded slowly. A dead man's last witness. Proof that he met Levinge. That no threat was necessary. That Claridge's involvement, whatever it was neither requested nor known. He acted alone, I said, to silence something that wasn't even dangerous anymore. And now, Holmes said grimly, he believes he must finish what he began. Levinge's voice broke. What will you do? Holmes turned to him, eyes sharper than razors. What Claridge does not expect, an end in daylight. Within the hour, Lestrade arrived at our request. Holmes shared every detail, including the sketch, the statement, the note, and Levinge's account. Lestrade listened grimly, nodding. I've got no proof Claridge murdered Fanshawe, he said, but I've got enough to question him on threat and fraud. If you can get him to talk, I will, Holmes said, but not by summons. He won't come if he knows the game is over. He must believe he's still ahead. And how do we do that? I asked. Holmes moved to the table and wrote quickly on a single sheet of paper. Then he handed it to Lestrade. We place this in the Evening Standard, he said. Front column. Let it read, Private acquisition of the Fanshawe portrait has been completed. Further inquiries may be directed to Mrs. Coralie Fanshawe's solicitor. Lestrade blinked. You're baiting him? I'm handing him his final mistake, Holmes said, and I'll be waiting at the Fanshawe house. That night fell swiftly. Fog coiled along the railings and clung to the lamplight like gauze. Mrs. Fanshawe agreed to leave the house, her staff sent away under Lestrade's care. Holmes and I took position in the parlor, the portrait returned to its original hiding place, beneath the false canvas, leaned against the easel. A single lantern was lit. The hour crept past 10, then 11, and just before midnight, a sound, the latch, a whisper of the door. Footsteps soft but certain. Holmes was still as glass beside the window. I crouched behind the screen, revolver drawn but heart thrumming. The figure moved into the studio slowly, his gloved hands steady. He made directly for the painting, not even glancing around. In the lantern light, I saw the side of his face. Claridge. He lifted the top canvas, saw the portrait beneath, stared, then bent forward, reached into his coat. Holmes stepped out in silence, revolver level. I'd suggest you leave that where it is, Mr. Claridge. Claridge froze, then slowly straightened, turning to face him. I suppose I should thank you, he said. You've brought it all together. The picture, the girl, the guilt. Holmes was calm. You murdered Fanshawe. He would have destroyed everything, Claridge hissed. Not just the painting, my name, my arrangements, my standing. He wasn't content with silence. He had to make meaning of it, and I couldn't let him. You tried to undo a truth, Holmes said softly. But it had already been seen. Claridge's face twisted, rage and weariness mingled. Then he stepped back, just enough for Lestrade to step from behind the curtain, a second revolver raised. It's over, Claridge. And just like that, it was. In the days that followed, Holmes remained unusually quiet. The painting was sealed, just as promised, and Mrs. Fanshawe sent word that she had left London for the coast. Levinge disappeared again, but not entirely. Holmes received a letter in an unfamiliar hand, brief, unsigned, but bearing the phrase, "Thank you for letting me be unfinished." On a quiet evening, I found Holmes staring into the fire. He looked older somehow. "Do you believe justice was done?" I asked. He didn't answer at once. Then, very softly, "Some truths belong in light. Others only needed to stop casting shadows." And with that, the case of the widow's shadow in the studio light was closed. The days that followed Claridge's arrest moved with a curious stillness, like air that held its breath. London, for all its thunder and steam, seemed to recede beyond the windows of Baker Street, muffled under a layer of ash-coloured peace. There was no fanfare in the press beyond the clipped acknowledgement that a man of private standing had been remanded on charges of falsified documentation and unlawful entry, and that further inquiries were ongoing. The deeper truths, the shadows that had stirred and stretched through a studio's light, remained sealed behind polished doors and discreet archives. Holmes did not pace, nor play the violin, nor embark on some brisk new case, as he so often did in the afterglow of a completed investigation. Instead, he sat for long hours in his chair by the fire, reading very little, speaking even less. When I pressed him, once lightly, he only looked at me with a tired sharpness and said, "There is thinking to be done, Watson. Thinking is not always movement." But I knew him too well. It was not the facts of the case that lingered with him, but its undercurrents, the choices not made, the portrait never finished. On the 4th day after Claridge's arrest, a small package arrived by morning post. No return address. A plain wrapping, tied with twine. Inside, carefully folded between 2 sheets of waxed paper, was a charcoal sketch. The same hand we had seen in the deposit box, firm, economical, and haunted. It was a portrait of Mrs. Fanshawe, not young, not posed, not romanticized. Her eyes were drawn with remarkable precision, shadowed, searching. The jaw slightly set, but not clenched. There was tenderness in it, honesty, too. Beneath the sketch, unsigned, were 4 words. She deserved her own. Holmes said nothing as he examined it, but he took great care in sliding it back into the envelope and placing it atop the file he kept in his desk drawer. One marked simply F. I did not ask whether it would be shared with her. I knew it would not. Later that afternoon, we received a final visit. Mrs. Coralie Fanshawe arrived without prior word, dressed in a slate-grey coat with a scarf pinned at the throat, her gloves neat but worn at the edges. She looked stronger than before, not hardened, but centered. The brittle tension that had once clung to her seemed to have peeled away. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, standing in the middle of the sitting room as though she wasn't sure she should sit at all. Holmes rose and bowed faintly. "Madam, you're well?" "As well as one can be." She glanced toward the fire, then to the windows, then back to us. "I came to thank you, not only for what you did, but for how you did it. Quietly, no parading, no verdicts." "We only exposed what was already threatening to break the surface," Holmes replied. "But not what lay beneath it," she said softly. There was a pause. "You saw the painting?" she asked. Holmes inclined his head. "We did." "It was strange," she said, "to look at a likeness I barely remembered posing for. I'd thought it would feel intrusive, but it didn't. It felt distant, like seeing a letter addressed to someone I no longer am." Holmes nodded once. "Your husband chose to leave it behind for you, however imperfectly." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I see that now. I also believe," Holmes added, "that he never intended it to harm you, or him." "No," she agreed, "but the past is a poor foundation, no matter how carefully one frames it." She sat then, unprompted, and folded her hands in her lap. "May I ask, Claridge, will he be tried?" Lestrade had visited that morning with an update. The case would proceed, but not as we had expected. There would be no murder charge. The official inquest into Fanshawe's death, though reopened, found insufficient forensic evidence to rule it anything but natural causes. A weak heart, exacerbated by stress. Perhaps an argument, perhaps a shock, but no proof of violence, no wounds. Claridge, instead, would be charged with criminal trespass, intimidation, and perjury. Enough to disgrace him, not enough to destroy him. Holmes relayed this without embellishment. She did not flinch. Then that's as it must be. What will you do now, Mrs. Fanshawe? I asked. I've sold the house, she replied. The studio, the garden. It was not mine to hold. I'm leaving London, the coast perhaps, or Italy. I've an invitation from an aunt in Florence. You intend to paint? Holmes asked, with the ghost of a smile. She actually laughed. Heavens, no. But I do intend to look. She stood again and took a slow breath as if letting something go. If you ever see Levinge again, she said, tell him I forgive him. Tell him I hope he draws light now, and only light. Holmes gave a faint nod. If he wishes to be found, I will. She offered us each her hand in farewell. Graceful, warm, and then was gone. The door closed. A silence followed, heavy but not unpleasant. Holmes returned to his chair and stared into the fire. Do you think she truly forgives him? I asked. She does, he said simply. And in that, she's wiser than most. And Levinge? Holmes reached for the envelope, now sealed again, and tapped it gently. Men who vanish tend to resurface, but not always in the places we expect. I do not think he will draw portraits again, Watson. But perhaps, if he allows it, he will draw peace. That night, as London drifted toward sleep and the gas lamps flickered like half-remembered thoughts, watched Holmes at his desk, setting aside the file with a kind of reverence. He said nothing further, made no grand pronouncements, and refused a fresh case Lestrade offered the next morning. But for all the quiet, I knew. There are mysteries that do not end with an arrest or a verdict or a name scratched on a warrant. Some close with the slow extinguishing of grief, the steady dimming of ghosts, and the folding of a canvas no one will ever hang. And so the case of the widow's shadow, chased across floorboards and memory through light and deception, came not to a thunderous conclusion, but to silence. A silence earned, a silence kept. It was several weeks later when the final turn arrived, not with a knock at the door or a telegram snapped under Holmes's fingers, but in the form of an ordinary envelope slipped through the post slot among circulars and the day's Times. It bore no return address, but the handwriting on it, thin and slanted to the left, was unmistakable. Holmes noticed it before I did, drawing it from the pile and examining the seal with narrowed eyes. He said nothing at first, only set aside his untouched breakfast and opened it with care. I watched as his gaze moved down the page, line by line, the faint flicker of curiosity tightening at the corners of his eyes. When he finally spoke, it was as though he had resumed a conversation that had merely paused. He's resurfaced, Holmes said quietly. Levinge? Holmes nodded and passed me the letter. It was written in charcoal-grey ink on thick cream paper. The words were neat, measured, every one chosen with care. To Mr. Holmes, and if he sees fit, to Dr. Watson also. I write not to reappear, but to clarify the lines I left half-drawn. You may keep this or burn it. I trust your judgment, if not your forgiveness. After the night at the Fanshawe studio, I went west, out beyond the city's reach. I have no fixed place, but I have found a room with a window, and the light is good. That is enough for now. I was not there the night Fanshawe died, but I believe he sensed what was coming. He had become quiet in those last weeks, you see. Reduced, not in mind, but in spirit, as though something inside him had completed its final line. The portrait of Lady Harrowgate. Yes, it was mine. But the canvas it lived on belonged in the end to him. He never forgave me for what I painted, and I never forgave him for keeping it. But somewhere in that bitterness, there was still recognition. We knew each other as few men do. And yet it was Coralie who stood at the center of it all, the one neither of us could capture as she truly was. Fanshawe loved her in the only way he knew, by making her see what she had never asked to see. I loved her foolishly, from the margins, and left only wounds. Your inquiry, your watching, unraveled more than a mystery. You ended something that had long passed the point of living. Thank you for that. You gave it shape and silence. I will not sign my name. Not out of cowardice, but out of understanding. A signature binds a thing. I am not yet finished. There was no flourish, no address. The letter had been posted in Devon, judging by the faint postmark at the edge. I lowered the paper and looked to Holmes. He had returned to his chair by the window, where a shaft of pale sunlight split across his shoulder and the lapel of his dressing gown. His eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in concentration, as though listening to some sound far beyond our room. "He's not coming back," I said. "No," Holmes murmured. "But he's no longer running either." "You believe him?" "I do." There was something final in Holmes's tone, not as if the story had ended, but as if the questions that mattered had resolved themselves in ways no tribunal or courtroom ever could. It was not the kind of closure I had once craved as a younger man. No gallows, no trial, no vindicating testimony. But I had learned from Holmes that not all puzzles need solving aloud. Some, if held up to the right light, simply show themselves and then quietly go still. It was 3 days later when Lestrade called on us again, this time with his coat still damp from the street and an expression that hovered between irritation and grudging admiration. "I don't know how you manage it," he said as he took the seat Holmes offered. "The Harrogate business, finished like a chess match while half the board was under the table. I had to sign off on Claridge's agreement this morning. 6 months, no contest, no appeal. He'll vanish into retirement with his name just far enough removed to avoid disgrace, but close enough to ensure it sticks." "Did he admit to anything further?" I asked. Lestrade shook his head. "Not a word about Fanshaw's death. Not a detail. His solicitor shut it down the moment I steered near it, but the message is clear enough. He's done, and so is the leverage he thought he had." Holmes gave a faint shrug. "He played the long game and overreached. Now the board resets." Lestrade gave Holmes a long look. "Still don't know how you untangled it." "Neither did the man who tied the knots," Holmes replied. Lestrade stood, adjusting his collar. "Well, you've earned your silence. But for what it's worth, I think you saved her, Mrs. Fanshawe. She was under the wheel without even knowing it." Holmes didn't smile, but there was a gentleness to the stillness that followed. After Lestrade had gone, I stood by the mantel and considered the chessboard Holmes had left in mid-game, 2 black bishops flanking a solitary white king. His hands remained folded, but I knew his mind had already moved on, not to another case, not yet, but to reflection. "I wonder," I said, "if she'll write to you." Holmes opened his eyes. "Number, but I believe she will write something for herself. And Lavinge." "He will finish her work," Holmes said. "It may not be a portrait, it may not be shown, but it will be his." I moved to the window, watching the carriages below, their wheels hissing faintly over damp cobbles. The city moved, oblivious as ever, but somewhere, out beyond its reach, a man was drawing again in peace, and a woman had chosen to leave behind a house of shadows for the clarity of light. In time I would record the case, as I have recorded this, and omit many names, but I would not forget the way Holmes had moved through it all, not with triumph, but with restraint, and not with judgment, but understanding. Some mysteries end not with revelation, but with release, and some portraits, once unburied, no longer need to be seen to be known. The case had begun with a widow and a shadow. It ended with no shadow at all. The final days of the affair passed not with upheaval, but with the soft drawing of curtains and the quiet shuffle of figures retreating from view. The portrait, both the physical one hidden beneath canvas and the larger one composed of people, secrets, and intentions, had revealed itself in full. Nothing more needed unearthing. No further shadow fell across the studio floor. I'd been reviewing my notes that evening, sorting through the tangle of facts and falsehoods, when Holmes re-entered from a walk he'd taken alone through the fog-wrapped streets. He removed his gloves methodically, brushing a faint sheen of mist from his coat sleeve, and looked not tired, but at ease, an expression I'd learned to recognize as rare and fleeting. "Have you finished your draft, Watson?" he asked lightly. "Nearly," I replied, setting down my pen, "though the conclusion has been unusually difficult." "Because the resolution was not one of justice in the traditional sense?" he asked, sitting down and stretching his long legs toward the fire. I nodded. There was no arrest for murder, no final accusation. The villain did not confess, and yet it was finished, Holmes said, his tone calm. Not all victories are won through confrontation. In this instance, the crime, if indeed it was a crime, was not rooted in violence, but in fear. And fear, as I have often said, is the most invisible of poisons. I considered that. Then you believe Fanshaw's death was not by design? Holmes leaned forward slightly. Claridge feared what the portrait represented. Exposure, yes, but also a collapse of control. When he found that Fanshawe had already offered the painting to his wife, his entire machinery of suppression became obsolete. I believe he confronted the artist. Whether he struck him or merely terrified him, we shall never know. But the result was the same. Fanshawe collapsed, and Claridge panicked. The rest was theatre. The threats, the shadow, the silence. And Levinge. Ah. Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. Levinge was the ghost of the piece, once a central figure, now reduced to outline. It was his portrait that set the world trembling, and yet he sought no gain from it. His retreat was not cowardice, but mercy. And Coralie Fanshawe. She emerged not simply as a widow, but as a survivor. She walked through a canvas of deceit and came out the other side intact. I turned toward the window, watching the gaslight flicker across the cobbles below. You often say you distrust sentiment in your work, Holmes, and yet this case, it was full of it. He smiled faintly. Not sentiment, Watson, human truth. It cannot always be measured or codified, but it drives motive more than gold ever will. This affair began with a shadow, cast in the light of a studio window, but it was never truly about apparitions. It was about what people fear when the light touches them, and what they're willing to do to keep their silhouettes from being seen. He stood then, slowly, with a motion that seemed to seal the matter not only in his mind, but in the room itself. He crossed to the window and opened it slightly, letting in the damp night air. "Do you know," he said, half to himself, "I think I shall write nothing of this case. Let it remain for once a private matter, a resolution not bound for the pages of the Strand." I smiled. "And what shall I tell our readers, then?" He turned with the barest glint in his eye. "Tell them that Sherlock Holmes once solved a case so delicate, so spectral, that even the truth preferred to whisper." And with that, he closed the window, doused the lamp, and let the final shadow of the widow's story dissolve into darkness. The case was closed, but its light, quiet and lasting, remained, 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 remained.